Thanks everybody for coming today. I'm really grateful to have a community of friends that would support me on something like this. I've always had a strong inner calling to teach and to present, and it's just kind of part of my makeup. To some extent, you might say that I had that opportunity in corporate life. So this is kind of a continuation of that, like the urge to give a presentation is irrepressible, if you will. But it's also part of, I've been exposed to the thinking of Carl Jung, and Carl Jung talks about the second half of life. And in the second half of life, we go through a process of what they call individuation, or becoming whole, undivided from yourself. And so, to me, this is the real me. I always wanted to be a professor and a lecturer when I grew up. And so that's what I'm doing. I told my friend Carol, do you think people will think I'm a little peculiar? And she said, no, these are your friends. They understand. It's just part of your makeup. So don't hesitate. Don't feel embarrassed. So, well, this is really sort of like, thank you, Janine. Sort of like on the first day of school when the teacher asks, what did you do on your summer vacation? But for me, it's what did I do during the COVID pandemic? And as part of my readings on Platonism and sacred geometry, I think you all know I'm interested in that. I was led to discover Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I found him as a fellow Platonist and a really, really fascinating figure. And then at the end of it, I looked back, I said, gosh, I read 18 separate books on Ralph Waldo Emerson and American Transcendentalism. So I'm not going to call myself an expert. This is really more of a book report, if you will. One of the things that I really like to do after I read something and learn something that I really want to learn is try to remember it. And I'm sure you can all identify with me in this kind of struggle to remember what you've read or even what you watched on TV last night or whatever. So, for me, this is just a way to retain what I learned and to be able to explain it in simple terms to others. So I hope that this will be my third time through it. I did it with some friends and I did it with my philosophy club. And hopefully you will get excited about Emerson yourself and want to actually read Emerson, because this is about Emerson and the whole different thing, reading Emerson than hearing about Emerson. So, one day on Facebook, I made a confession. I said, oh no, I think I'm becoming a Pythagorean. And a friend of mine said, well, I'm not surprised. So in full disclosure, I do consider myself a Platonist and a Pythagorean of sorts. And in this presentation, you'll hear what I mean by that, really. And to quote the words of Martin Luther, he said, Hier stehe ich kann nicht anders. Here I stand, I can do no other. So I have approximately 101 slides to present. And that will be about 4 hours of material based on my previous experience, which would give me about 2.11 minutes per slide. So hopefully I can pace myself and make it so that I'm not, I get to the goals that I want to. So I'll definitely stop a little bit before 5 o'clock to hear some comments, feedback, any pressing questions. Certainly I'm willing to stay longer than that if you would like. So my technology here. So Ralph Waldo Emerson actually was known as Waldo. And he was truly an American original. He was really the first important public intellectual at a very pivotal time in US history. He was a leader in the Transcendentalist community, and he's what I would call a modern American Neoplatonist, which was a real aha moment for me, that you don't have to go all the way back to ancient Greece to find these ideas living. He was actively involved in the philosophical and theological discussions from ancient to modern times. And he certainly put America on the map in terms of intellectual history. Oftentimes he is portrayed as being propagating a specifically American style of thought. And yes, he did talk about that, and we'll see that. But he wasn't just interested in promoting American intellectual thought. His ideas very much emerge out of a European context and also non-Western thought. You'll see it's really important for bringing some of these ideas into the public discourse. And he had literally international standing and influence as a writer and lecturer. And to some extent, he was actually better known in Europe than he was even in the United States. So it's not just an American thing. Lots of kind of snooty academics in some of the books that I've read say, well, Emerson is not a real philosopher. And saying he's amateurish, he uses a kind of a flimsy reasoning. But yet there's thinkers like Nietzsche, William James, John Dewey, who are all very respectful of Emerson and promoted him. And he remains a really important figure in literary history. And what I like about him is that he wasn't just an intellectual. A lot of the way that philosophy is taught is just frustrating. Like, what are you talking about? And having taken a lot of philosophy courses, I can testify to that. But Pythagoras was the person that coined the term philosophy, philo, sophia, love of wisdom. And so this is really what Emerson concerned himself with. How should life be led? How do you control your thinking, to develop your thinking so that you lead the right kind of life. He was really a philosopher who was a friend of wisdom and for developing one's thinking in life very much in harmony with wisdom. So this is also, I'm going to talk about some things that happened in his life, but it's also an intellectual biography. So what was he thinking about? Who was he talking to? What was he reading? What were the actual ideas? So I'll kind of weave together different ideas with, stuff that was happening in his life. And I use kind of a spiral structure, if you will. I'll keep returning to certain themes that recur throughout his life and throughout his thinking. The first thing I want to put out there is, so why? I mean, why did you get so obsessed with Ralph Waldo Emerson? And I have a kind of an obsession really with reaching back to touch ancestors, reaching back to touch the past, imagining the experience of people from the distant past and discovering their wisdom and their experience in life. For those of you who know, I did a work on Dante's Inferno, which I was fascinated with. And then I did a work on the goddess Inanna, who was from ancient Sumeria. And so it's kind of a consistent theme that I really like going back in history. I like seeing things in a context. I like seeing how things that we experience today are very much connected with things in the past. And so Emerson represents a kind of a connection, not only with a distant past, but a more recent past. It's also, when I think about Emerson's life, this period, 1810 through 1880 in America, is what you would call the American Renaissance. It was a really vibrant time, a time of community and conversations, people establishing salons, with an impassioned sharing of ideas. And so to me, just kind of like I think about Paris in the 30s or something, you know, Boston in the 19th century was like a very exciting place. And I would like to come back and be a part of that. So it was a very exciting time. It was a time of tremendous social change and a lot of aha moments for me, in that I thought 1960s maybe was the start of social change. Well, it really goes back to the early 19th century, a lot of the social movements that we're a part of. And he was an out and out Platonist. And ever since I started studying philosophy and religion, kind of liked the Plato stuff. It's what they call idealism. And so here, as I mentioned before, here was a man that, in our own country in a relatively modern time, they brought those ideas to life. He dedicated his life to studying the mind and to studying consciousness, something that I find really fascinating. And when I originally heard about him and the word transcendental, I said, well, that sounds good. I like that word. Transcendental, something that surpasses, something that climbs beyond, something that is spiritual, non-physical, beyond ordinary experience. So I kind of felt like anybody that's a transcendentalist must be my kind of person. Emerson also was a philosopher and a poet, and we'll talk a little bit about his idea about what poetry is and the role of the poet. And so that's, for me, it's a kind of a connection between two things that I love. And I, much to my mother's consternation, when I went to college, I became a religious studies major, which was very impractical, but I have always been interested in the religious nature of man. And Emerson was interested in that too. And it was very much in the forefront of people's consciousness at that time. Why are people the way we are? There's even some books called Why Won't the Idea of God Go Away? Why are we made this way? What I would call homo religiosus. And then just in itself, the history of religion in America is another really, really fascinating topic. And so this is, he's very, very much a part of that really vital and interesting history. And then the last thing about why I'm so fascinated with Emerson is that he was an austere personality in some ways. He was exceptionally disciplined, and yet also kind of ecstatic at the same time. And so I liked that something that I can relate to. He's really hardworking, but also really seeking, sort of something beyond that. So, in brief, what is Transcendentalism? So Transcendentalism was a community of people that existed in 19th century Boston. Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, a fascinating figure in her own right, Amos Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott with Little Women, Theodore Parker, a abolitionist, and also the fascinating Peabody sisters. And I really enjoyed throughout this learning about the role of women in Transcendentalism, and women were starting to come into their own as intellectuals at that time. So it was a movement that included women. A key date is 1836, when Emerson and a group of other people established what they called the Transcendentalist clubs. And it didn't really last that long, but it was key in bringing people together. And he published his seminal essay called Nature, which actually was one of the things that really, when I read that, I was just flabbergasted at how beautiful and interesting that was. So 1836 was the year when he wrote that essay, and it started to hit the public. Transcendentalism is not a unified system of thought. It's a complex cluster of ideas. And it's, you know, a bunch of people thinking in a different ways that were sort of associated with each other. And it was, you know, mostly a New England phenomenon, but it did extend to Europe. And it really, it was a powerful influence in bringing about social change. It shows that our roots in social change, which still exists with us in America and in the world at large, they run deep. And this is rooted in philosophical thinking, and it's philosophy that makes a difference, in society. And that's very much part of what Transcendentalism was. Those people and this thinking impacted the abolition of slavery, religious liberalism, the rise of religious liberalism and secularization in America. Were very much involved in educational reform. And it was really revolutionary at its time. So, so what were some of the core principles on a philosophical basis? Well, the word transcendentalism originally came from Immanuel Kant, 19th century German philosopher. And his philosophy, he talked about the working of the mind being called transcendental philosophy, because they posit that there's an inherent element of the mind that transcends the experience of the senses. And that's an idea that I find very appealing. That these things in the mind and these ideas, they're real, just as real as something that you can touch and feel and smell and those kind of things. Really key idea in Transcendentalism is the power of the individual, the power of nature, and the power of the self. They also talk, which is a connection with Platonist philosophy, talk about the soul, stressing that there is a divine force in each individual. And this divine force, which is the very definition of what man is, if you will, it has the power to transform lives. So that the idea of transformation or metamorphosis is also very much a part of it. It's inherently democratic, which is an appealing notion. Of course, you can't be anti-democratic and also feel that each person has a piece of the divine within them, and that there's a power in the self. So that's very appealing. And then there's the idea that the holy is found in common places. The holy is found in nature. And I'm sure you all stand with me on the incredible beauty of nature and the importance of that. They emphasize the power of intuition, rather than empirical or logical reasoning, and a sense of the beyond, that they were seeking mental and spiritual states that transcended just what's in the physical world. A really key concept, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, is the concept of self-reliance. And you've probably heard of the very important essay by Emerson on self-reliant, that the self-reliant man to some extent defies convention. The self-reliant man stands up for truth and right, even against convention and tradition, and often finds a need to break with traditional structures. Also, the idea of trusting yourself. So those are really sort of some of the key ideas. So what about all this Platonism stuff? What are the Platonist ideas that are within Emerson's thought? Well, Emerson had a profound respect throughout his life for Plato. Said Emerson, Plato is clothed with the powers of the poet. And we'll see a little bit later how the word poet had a very specific meaning with Emerson. He said, out of Plato come all things that are written and debated among men of thought. And Plato's writings have preoccupied every school of learning, every lover of thought, every church, every poet. And his encounter with Plato, which occurred quite early in his life was the source of Emerson's lifelong conviction that ideas are real. And actually ideas are, and you might have heard the term, the forms, the Platonic forms. There's forms and laws and ideas that actually underlie, precede, and explain appearances. So that's the fundamental notion. And, so that the forms, the Greek word for it is eidos. They are not less real than the phenomenal world, and that there is a reality, there's a realm of pure and permanent ideas that when we enter into the world of what he calls the world of becoming, where things start and end and change, and those things. There's another world where things don't start and end and change, where things are, truths exist for forever, if you will. There's an interesting etymology that I discovered with the word eidos, and eidos, which is the word for forms or ideas, is also related to the Latin word videre, which means to see. And so that, you'll often find, especially in Platonic thinkers, the concept of light and knowing and seeing all kind of come together, so that there's this sense of seeing that has to do with ideas, or the symbolism of seeing is closely associated with it. Plato and early Pythagorean thinkers use the word cosmos. Now we think cosmic is like, ooh, psychedelia or something like that. But the word cosmos actually in ancient Greek means an ordered universe, a beautifully ordered universe. And so this idea, you see it in Plato, you definitely see it in Emerson's thinking. So that the vision of nature being part of this, this beautifully ordered universe. And the word immanence, meaning it's right here, that spirit is immanent in nature. And that this transcendent qualities are actually revealed through the material world. And I know you all stand with me. I'm sure you've all had those kind of experiences. It's a very different than a typical Christian notion of God that's outside the world, and that the world is fallen. And you will see that Emerson in himself, he rebelled against that notion and lots of the institutionalized ways of that Christianity manifested itself. Again, we'll go back to the idea of personal divinity. There is a universal divine that is in each individual and is also in nature. And that this is, if you look at the history of Christianity going all the way back, it's constantly this kind of struggle between the dogma, the orthodoxy, the institutionalized church, and the notion that God is within and is not a set of rules or writings of the Bible or anything like that. There is a connection between the individual and this. Emerson used the term the oversoul, that it's kind of part of us or floating through us, or we're floating through it, or there's an intersection of the divine and the physical, which manifests itself in the way that humankind is. And again, that there is what we would call a truth intuiting faculty that is inherent in the human psyche. And that this is what Plato would call the ascent of consciousness. There are stages that take you higher and closer to these kind of divine realities, if you will. A little bit about mind and consciousness, which was really what throughout his life, Waldo really was his favorite thing was to discuss mind and consciousness. Plato taught about dialectic in the mind. So what is dialectic? What does that exactly mean? So dialectic means a form of reasoning. It's a kind of proposition and counter proposition that brings one to understanding. But in Platonic terms, it also is the basis of the way that the mind works. And so this process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis takes you higher, gets you closer to things which are true. And inherent in this is the idea of the opposites. Emerson said the opposites are the gods of the mind. And what does this mean? That you can't really think about something's existence without thinking about its non-existence, that being and non-being are one and the same thing. And there's, there's an Aristotelian notion, they call it the Aristotelian table of opposites. There's a fundamental kind of opposition that it is part of the balance of life. So you'll see limit and unlimited, female and male, light and darkness, rectangles and squares, all of these kind of concepts of the opposites is part of this dialectic. And through this dialectic, the mind is able to work and reach higher and higher levels. The mind perceives that which is beyond and outside the mind, and through the mind, one can experience things that are unlimited. And I don't just mean this to be, sort of like divine states of ecstatic states of consciousness, although that too is part of it. Understanding mathematical realities, or things that are eternally true are part of the way that mind is created. Emerson was always drawn to this idea of thought. What is thought? And he called it man thinking, which is a concept that he got from his Aunt Mary, who we'll talk about. He was also very interested in the experience of awakening and the dawning of insight, which is also kind of, connected to the idea of consciousness in the mind. And, if you think about it too, that this gift of thinking that we have, things that we see, things that we think, things that we understand, that we have the human race has incomparable analytical abilities, and that are just amazing. And again, going back to the inherently democratic part of this, there's that the intellect is alive in each person. The idea that it's both a blessing and a responsibility to use the intellect in a beautiful and truthful way, and so it's part of our in acts of thinking and expression and the way that we live our life. I talked earlier about the idea of homo religiosus. As a religious studies major myself, this has always been something that I've been fascinated by. There's a principle in human nature from which religion springs, the desire to establish some kind of a relationship with a reality that is more perfect, that has an era of universality to it. And this recurrence of religious experience, that this kind of experience of oneness with the infinite, a moment in which there is only everything, this kind of state of consciousness, that it keeps happening. It happens. It's part of the way the human brain is constructed. And I've read of, there's a man named Andrew Newberry that talks about that, the religious experience and the brain. And it can even be related to if you're really good at something, right? And the part of the brain that is activated when you're doing something, you're totally involved with something you're really good at. It's the same part of the brain that's activated when somebody's having a religious vision, or like perhaps a Sufi mystic might have, or something like that. So again, I don't want to be totally like out there. It's some of these experiences that I'm talking about are very, very concrete and real. There's an idea of, I'll talk a little bit more about the word epiphany, reaching the moment of understanding. And there's a word kairos. And kairos is this concept of time where time is suspended. It's not sequential time. It's time when all time seems to be present in that moment. There's a fascinating figure I've always heard about, whose thinking was influential at this time in is Germaine de Staël. And she was a prominent public intellectual in post-revolutionary France. I haven't had a chance really to read her yet, but I got a few books on the shelf lined up to read about that. But one of the things that she talked about was the power of religious feelings, that religion centering on the feeling of the infinite and absence of limits. And, you know, some of the people in the Catholic Church in France, of course, were offended by that. That they wanted to be in charge of all of the ideas. And de Staël actually said life should be one continuous act of worship. Life is not about creeds and dogma and those kind of things. And she talked about, there's a fascinating word, perhaps you've heard of this use, enthusiasm. Well, enthusiasm used to be used in a very different way than we use it. We use it like you're really excited about something, but the derivation of the word is actually entheos. That means actually to be filled with God. And so de Staël was bringing that kind of thinking, and that humans are born with this kind of natural veneration or reverence for the world, for the beauty of the world, for love, and these feelings that run through us, and also bringing this notion that the divine is nature is present in all persons. For Emerson, the religious impulse demanded expression and communication with others, and so this is part of what he meant by poetry too, that you can't just experience it, it's got to come out in some way. So that was kind of an Emersonian concept. You know, the impact of Transcendentalism that continues to be with us today. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, social justice emerges naturally from this kind of thinking. In community with nature, each person understands beauty, goodness, and truth. And those are three, you know, like words very important to Platonists. There's also that it's important to note that the industrialism, which started in the 18th century, kind of the natural outgrowth of that would be sort of like this rampant materialism, which was existing, that of course Transcendentalism was born in reaction to that, coming up with sort of a dream set of ideals. Transcendentalism also came up with the idea that a robust democracy has to accommodate many religious perspectives. And they really wanted to overturn dogmatism and rigidity. And ironically enough, though America was supposed to be a place of religious freedom, they quickly, like anything that gets institutionalized, quickly gets, rigid and trying to stamp out dissent and all of those kind of things. So it was really a very important force in bringing around more tolerance in religion in America. There was a focus on education, which continues today. Think about a time when there was rote learning and students were whipped into learning, and you know, there arose a lot of thinking around the student-centered education. It was concerned with cultivating the life of the mind. And there's the idea, education, the root of the word education, educere, is the idea of drawing out something that already lies within. That should be what education is to some extent. And it's a kind of a Platonic notion that through the mind we can sort of bring out things that we already know or know to be true. As I mentioned earlier, Transcendentalism was very important in promoting the rights of women, in promoting the arts, as was the Unitarian Church, and also with its the journal that they had called The Dial. It was had an impact on American journalism as well. That through these kind of esoteric journals, you can spread religious and social debate to a wide community of people. So I'm going to take a drink. You really can't talk about Emerson and Transcendentalism without talking about Unitarianism in America. And I know my friend Carrie is on the call, and we were talking about this once because she's a Unitarian and very interested in the Unitarian Church. Dr. William Ellery Channing was the founder of Unitarianism. He lived from 1740 to 1842. He actually only attended one meeting of the Transcendentalists, and to some extent, he thought the Transcendentalists might be going too far. However, he had a direct influence on all of the major Transcendentalist thinkers, including the wonderful Elizabeth Peabody, who kind of studied under him, if you will. She's really cool. We'll talk about her a little bit later. And Unitarianism was really important in religious liberalism and secularization of American life. It can directly trace its origins to Channing. He gave a famous sermon in 1819, which is called the Baltimore Sermon, which actually ushered in a new era in liberal American theology. He started as a strict Calvinist Congregationalist, which was kind of the dominant church in New England at that time. But then he started preaching a Unitarian Christianity. He rejected the notion of the Trinity, saying that the doctrine of the Trinity subverts the unity of God. And I have to say I sort of agree with this, certainly that the early Christian church, in arriving at the doctrine of the Trinity, kind of had to tie itself in knots to come up with this plausible solution about Jesus. And you know, Channing started preaching against that, that he thought that that subverted what he called the unity of God, which makes a lot of sense to me. He had a strong belief in human goodness versus, you know, some of the kind of ideas of original sin that might have been around prior to that. And he thought that all theological ideas should be subject to the light of reason. That the freedom of individual thought is key. And that the ultimate reference of a human being has to be his own mind. He talked also about, and this goes back to what we said about Castille, religion as an inner experience. So he really allowed for religious individualism and very open discussion of philosophical and social ideas. You didn't have to be afraid. You didn't have to feel that you were going to get burned at the stake or, you know, shunned or whatever. He never really wanted to start a denomination, but gradually he came to accept the word Unitarian. He thought that predestination was a ridiculous idea. That would turn a human being, which is a very Calvinist idea, that would turn a human being into some sort of a machine. We're not machines. We have freedom of thought, and that is really the beauty of the human animal. And he had a universalist perspective on world religions as well. And at this time, there starts to be a lot of, it wasn't just the Beatles that got interested in Maharishi Mahesh Yoga, that people at that time were very much interested in Eastern religions. And this was promoted also with Channing's philosophy. He was an anti-war activist, and also he was against the false kind of patriotism that would elevate one nation over another, which I must say I agree with also. And he was also a strong influence on Theodore Parker, who was a very popular radical and leader, especially in the abolitionist movement of the time. How is this related to Immanuel Kant? Immanuel Kant's, well, prior to Immanuel Kant, the philosophy of Hume and Locke and such people, they were known as materialists or as rationalists. They talked about knowing being, it's only dependent on the senses. And something about that never quite sat right with Emerson. And you could say he basically spent his life trying to, prove that thinking was wrong. Kant, and I'm no Kantian. You could spend your whole life, and half of it I have no idea what he's talking about. But he lived in 1724 through 1804. He brought about what they called the Copernican revolution in philosophy, which is basically the idea that the objects of the senses conform to spatial and temporal forms of intuition that we have a priori in our minds. And so that's the idea, that there's certain ways that the mind is constructed that allow us to understand things, even apart from the senses. Certain things, especially notions of time and space, which is kind of cool. Emerson thought of himself as a Kantian, that the idea that there's some ideas that don't come from experience, but they are intuitions of the mind itself. And this fits in the definition of idealism, permanent truths that exist beyond the physical world. Emerson actually preferred to refer to himself as an idealist rather than a transcendentalist, because it wasn't just against dogmatic religion, it was also kind of a spiritual outlook, which he felt was better captured by the notion of idealism. Yeah, I think that's probably as much as I need to say about Immanuel Kant. Also very important is the relation of Transcendentalism to the Romantic movements, Romantic poets, Romantic thinkers that were going on at the time. Romanticism, with its key notion that the material world is mere appearance, while reality exists in a realm of pure and permanent ideas of the imagination. It was a very, very important role of the creative imagination. And that the human being has a capability of apprehending certain truths intuitively through these moments. A lot of what the Romantic poets, for example, Coleridge and Wordsworth, were looking for were these breakthrough moments where an image or the nature struck them, and suddenly the world broke open, where they understood things. And you can, one famous poem that Coleridge had was called Frost at Midnight, where he goes outside at night with his newborn child, and suddenly the world breaks open. That they were seeking these moments where interaction with images, and together Coleridge and Wordsworth wrote the lyrical ballads, which they were trying to exemplify or bring into being this philosophy that they had about the moment of epiphany, the moment where the consciousness was transformed. And the preface to the lyrical ballads actually kind of lays that out, which is interesting. Coleridge himself was quite an interesting figure. He was a drug addict, but he was also a genius, and he wrote lots of essays as well as amazing poetry. And he talked about the underlying spiritual energy behind sensory experience. And he was known to be quoted as saying, "Under the despotism of the eye, this strong sensuous influence, we are restless because invisible things are not the objects of vision." So, you can really see those type of ideas also permeating the transcendentalist schools of thought. At the same time, German idealism, Schiller, Schelling, Heine, Fichte. My friend Lisa's on the call. She's a scholar in German. She might have read some of those. They were really influential, particularly Goethe. And Goethe, one of the things, apart from the fact that he wrote Faust and Sorrows of Young Werther and stuff like that, Goethe was very interested in the idea of Bildung. Bildung is a German idea for education, but it's kind of better word than education because it includes in it the idea of self-cultivation. Self-cultivation, the learning passionately, trying to figure things out. And Goethe, I think, was actually most proud of his work with light. He probably didn't get as far as Sir Isaac Newton did on that, and he got a few things wrong, but he was that people were actively engaging with science, engaging with math, as a way of kind of elevating consciousness. And at the same time, there were certain thinkers. One was Emanuel Swedenborg, and I've always heard a lot about him, as well as Jakob Böhme, who were kind of mystical philosophers. And so all of this was going on and very much affecting the thinking of the time. It's important to note that around this time, the 18th and 19th century, what they call biblical criticism was starting to come into its own. And biblical criticism doesn't mean criticizing the Bible. It means kind of understanding the influences on the Bible, what the sources were, how it came together. And so what you see happening is a kind of an ironic, on the one hand, the Bible is being kind of torn apart and people are getting skeptical about it. But at the same time, there was a rebirth of kind of romantic Christianity that you can see in the work of the romantic philosophers of Schleiermacher, for example, is one of the important theologians of the time that was called Romantic Christianity. Waldo's brother actually he wanted to be a minister, and he went to Germany and he discovered the works of Schleiermacher, and he wrote back to Waldo and said, "Hey, you've got to read this guy. He's really great." And you could actually say that Schleiermacher was the founder of modern liberal theology, that subjective feeling is what counts more than creeds or rationality, and that actually this subjective feeling was at the basis of the teachings of Jesus, according to Schleiermacher. So again, they were having like lots of new ways of looking at the Bible, looking at the sources and interpreting it. So it's part of the context that we're in with Transcendentalism. Overall, historically, kind of it's important to realize, and this was a kind of silly in a way, but an aha moment. It wasn't really that long after the American Revolution. America was still a young country. America was seeking to define itself. What was post-revolutionary America like? And one of the things that actually Waldo's grandfather, William, actually fought in the Revolutionary War. So the direct connection, it feels like it can just take a few jumps and you get all the way back there. Something that usually seems distant wasn't really so distant. It was a time of discovery. The American geography, this fantastic continent that we live on, it was the Louisiana Purchase, and the Lewis and Clark expedition happened in 1803. We didn't even know what was on this continent. Well, some people knew what was on the continent, but but the geography itself of America, it's, of course, you would get this thinking about a natural sublime. It is an absolutely sublime continent. And so, it just seems kind of natural, just geographically speaking, that something like Transcendentalism would come out of that. There was a rebirth in the arts, the American Renaissance, where you have Whitman, Emerson, Hawthorne. Was a lot of creative ideas were happening. It was a time of anti-materialism. I mentioned that earlier. It's a natural backlash to industrialism, and the bankers and the commerce and monetary wealth and those kind of things. So it's natural there would exist some thinking on the sidelines. It was a time of American expansionism, and we'll see that that becomes really a key idea. How the annexation of Texas, conquering Mexico, expanding slavery. Kansas joined the Union in 1821, and they were surrounded in controversy of, should it be a slave state? Should it not be a slave state? All of that is really churning. America is trying to grapple with that kind of continental expansion. And then the other thing is very important, and we'll see the direct impact of this, the tuberculosis epidemic and other deadly diseases was rampant. There were no vaccines, there were no antibiotics, and lockjaw, scarlet fever, tuberculosis. It's kind of important to keep that in mind. It's a different world, really, than the one that we live in today. This time of American history was a very radical time. Reforms fever was sweeping the country. It was time when Frederick Douglass was working. John Brown, Theodore Parker, I mentioned him earlier, Walt Whitman, Thoreau with the civil disobedience. So lots of kind of radical ideas. And it goes without saying that abolitionism was, really starting to come to a boil. And of course, it comes to real boil during the Civil War and prior to the Civil War. Feminism was on the rise, which is, I think, another reason I'm kind of naturally attracted to this period. And to some extent, you could say women are just trying to make a living. If you didn't have a husband through whom you could make a living, what were you going to do? And it was really difficult. Then we'll see that the role of a spinster, couldn't get a job, if she wanted to be a writer, couldn't do that. And sort of being dependent on your brother, your father, being taken care of by the family. Women really just didn't have very good economic options. And so some of the women that we encounter in Transcendentalism, Elizabeth Peabody, for example, her father was chronically bankrupt, and she ended up starting a bookstore called the West End Bookstore in Boston, which was key in the movement. But she had to figure out a way. So that I think that is a really strong impulse behind feminism, is just the economic. Women needed to break through, so they found better means of survival. In Boston, at the West End bookstore that was run by Elizabeth Peabody, they started something called Conversations, where women started coming together just to talk about intellectual topics and learn how to exercise their minds, learn how to discuss with each other. We'll talk a lot more about Margaret Fuller. I really had never heard about Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller is an absolutely critical person in American history and women's history, and she's a fascinating figure. And there were things called Blue Stockings clubs that were coming at the time. So all of that was churning. There were quite a few socialist experiments, communes, that were started at that time. The Ripleys started something called Brook Farm. Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father, started something called Fruitlands. And ultimately, probably like most communes from the 60s, it failed. They didn't have proper governance, if you will. But there is a lot of that going on. It was a time when, this goes back to the concept of Bildung, or self-cultivation, a time when adult education was deemed to be really, really important. And there was something called the Lyceum movement. The Lyceum was actually the location of Aristotle's school. That Plato had an academy, Aristotle had a Lyceum. So that's the reference to that. And the Lyceum movement started around the 1820s and continued through the Civil War. And its idea was creating an informed citizenry. And adults, many adults, there wasn't TV and there wasn't the internet. A lot of people attended these Lyceum lectures. And actually, I learned through this there's a place in San Francisco called the Mechanics Institute Library. And I'm like, what is this? Why is there something called the Mechanics Institute Library, and you can join it, and it's a quiet place to go read, and it's right down in the financial district. But that is also associated with the Lyceum movement. Mechanics institutes were instituted in Britain, for the most part, to try to diffuse useful knowledge to people. It's a time, we'll see a lot more about this, where there's a new openness to Persian thought, to Asian thought. Again, long before the hippies discovered, Alan Watson and the like, the Transcendentalists were definitely into that. It's also important to mention that spiritualism, theosophy, there's a woman called Madame Blavatsky, interest in esotericism, the occult, phrenology, reading the lumps on your head, mesmerism, clairvoyance, all of these things are going on at that time. And usually I would, before I started reading a little bit more about this, I would think of that as kind of quacks and, but if you look at it in a different light, Sigmund Freud didn't exist yet. Psychology per se was only a kind of a baby science. So we have to look at these kind of assays into spiritualism as part of people just really trying to understand their own psychology and the makeup of human nature. And there was a lot that could be understood from that. The word occult, actually, we think of it as like witchcraft or weird, or stay away from those people because they're freaky. But actually, the word occult is a really great word. It means hidden from the eye, where something is mysterious. And there's actually a term in geometry for the occult center of a rectangle, for example. So I kind of have a new appreciation for that type of thinking and those movements. It's important to say that at least at first or earlier in his career, Emerson kind of had a distaste or aversion for activist pronouncements. He didn't really want to be sucked into social reform. He wanted to present himself as a scholar rather than as a reform professional. And to some extent, he didn't get sucked in that much, but his way of reforming society was to create a community in his own hometown that was a kind of a forum for mutual enlightenment. One of the quotations that I found from him, he said, "Those of us who do not believe in communities believe in neighborhoods, and that the kingdom of heaven may consist of such." And I really like that, especially since I live in Rossmore now, which I consider definitely to be part of the kingdom of heaven, because it's really a vital, active place. I'm going to take a detour here to talk a little bit about self-reliance. Self-reliance is probably Emerson's most important essay that he wrote. A lot of people know about this, and you can really say that it summed up his life philosophy, and it really is the best single key to his thought, a thread that goes throughout all of his thinking. Some people have taken up the concept of self-reliance as meaning rugged individualism. Somebody like Henry Ford or John D. Rockefeller, that it's people that have this gusto for entrepreneurial rapacity and imperial conquest. And I would beg to differ with those notions, that it has come to symbolize individualism, but in the negative way, individualism sort of fetishizing self-esteem. But really, yes, Emerson was an individualist, but he was moreover a universalist and an internationalist. He thought a thinking person's first allegiance was to be independent, and that individualism, what that really meant, is pursuing the ideal self, in building your own world, in looking at the world with your own eyes. And he didn't want to exalt individualism per se, but to release minds from contextual imprisonment. And that cultural awakening is energized by independent individuals. And certainly at this time, even throughout the world, even across the Atlantic with John Stuart Mill, and the idea that a dissent actually strengthens the social order. There's also a notion about individuality in contrast to mass culture. And one of the essays that Emerson wrote was about, can't remember the name right now, the British personality, but when he did travel in England, he could see that there was a stronger tolerance in England for what he called personal eccentricity. And I think I can see what he means, that, and certainly Transcendentalism had its share of eccentrics, and kind of one of those other things I kind of like about it, I'm attracted to. Self-reliance is the idea, an ethos or a practice that's intended to retrieve a person from what is expected of you, and doing what you most deeply believe. A self-reliance Emerson would say is soul reliance, being your ideal self. What do you need to do to achieve that? He was really against idolizing mentors and leaders, which is part of why he was sort of so iconoclastic in terms of classic Christianity. He didn't want to go back to some ideas that were created thousands of years ago and some guys that wrote it down. It just struck him as inherently wrong. He was known to say, I don't need the old world. I need the new me. And so he was very much wanted to defend individuals against social pressure. The Transcendentalist philosophy actually has a sort of a lonely rectitude to it, that the price of enlightenment can be emotional isolation at times, sort of like being on your own path, becoming your own ideal self. But, of course, it's not what Waldo prescribed. He didn't prescribe insular withdrawal from the world. He prescribed a very robust coexistence. He was known to say, is it so bad then to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates and Jesus and Luther and Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. So going back to kind of religious history in America and Transcendentalism, there is the idea that there's a connection between individualism and the inner light. And of course, there's a pietistic strain that runs throughout Protestant Christianity, Protestant spirituality, the hour of vision, the appeal to kind of mystical experience. And even after he kind of abandoned his church position, Emerson felt of any religion closest to Quakerism, and Quakerism has the image of the inner light. Emerson's family was part of the Great Puritan migration of the 17th century. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the irony of those that came to America seeking religious freedom systematically denied it to others. And if you look at like how Congregationalism manifested itself in New England society, you were required to be a part of the church that was ruling that town, basically. You were required, it's like you were taxed, basically. And it was, but anyways, his family came in, and they were always more or less on the side of what you would call the new lights versus the old lights. There was what they call the Great Awakening that occurred in the 18th century, which was stimulated by Jonathan Edwards, another man named George Whitefield, the inner work of the Holy Spirit, an unmediated experience of divinity. And as a matter of fact, whole towns were divided, had little wars with each other, the new lights and the old lights, and the old lights wanted to keep more of a control on the dogma. And there was also an element of misogyny to it, because women were seen as enthusiastic, right? That we said earlier, the word entheos. So those crazy women go, they think they're filled with the holy light and filled with the divine, and we gotta tell them what their place is. So it was seen as being sort of these revivals. The old lights thought that there was kind of a revival induced disobedience that was generated among women. Emerson famously wrote he was really into the art of biography and writing biographies. And he wrote famously a biography of Luther, George Fox, who founded Quakerism, Böhme, and Swedenborg, and Swedenborg, and that the commonality with all of those figures was that each owed all to the discovery that God must be sought within, not from without. Again, social justice emerges naturally from this kind of inner light kind of thinking, that if the divine is within, then democracy and equality must be the next logical steps. And certainly Republican democratic political theory is focused on that, the inherent equality and the value of all persons. And the autonomy of individual consciousness. Emerson wrote in one of his notebooks, though few men since the creation of the world live according to the dictates of reason, yet all men are capable of so doing. That is the equality and the only equality of all men. And we will read that as being men and women. So a little bit about Emerson's family. Emerson was born in 1803. His father was a Unitarian minister. I think there were 30 in Emerson's family history, like 30 different ministers. That's what they did. It was like a genetic predisposition or something. His mother was pietistic, kind of a cold fish, I think, actually. I don't have a really good impression of his mom, but she was very interested in the kind of practical guides to living a Christian life. And the family was poor, but as with many ministers at the time, they lived a life of genteel poverty. Ralph was the third of 6 sons. And his dad actually died in 1811 when Ralph was only 8. He died of stomach cancer. And his mother took in boarders to get her sons educated. Emerson's life was filled with tragedy. So he was really coping with lots of intense issues. His father died when he was 8. He was born in a time of disease and death. 2 of his brothers died of tuberculosis. He had one mentally retarded / mentally ill brother. His best friend Thoreau died. His first wife died. His first son died. His friend Margaret Fuller, intellectual partner, died. He had struggles with his eyes, probably associated with tuberculosis, poor eyesight. His house burnt down, and he had marital issues in his second marriage. So he was, dealing with a lot. He did not necessarily have an easy life. Just a little bit, the brothers are very important. His oldest brother, William, was born in 1801. He lived to the age of 67. He actually studied theology in Göttingen in Germany, but he ended up practicing law. Actually, I think he worked in the Daniel Webster's law office or something like that. Ralph, born 1803, his brother Edward was born in 1805, died of TB at the age of 29. His very dear brother, Charles, had tuberculosis and also died. When I came upon Emerson's aunt, Mary Moody Emerson, through the brilliant work of this writer named Phyllis Cole, I thought, I've got it, proving the importance of aunts, because for those of you that know me know that being an aunt is really important to me. And certainly Mary Moody Emerson was very important to Ralph's development. I mean, he was his own man. It wasn't like he was his aunt's marionette or anything like that. And at some point he kind of had to break away from her because she was a little bit nutty. But in her own right, this kind of makes the point of women and what could they do. Mary Moody Emerson was an autodidact. She was a brilliant person. She never got married. And she was a true scholar, but she never had a way to get it out there. There weren't those means at that time. And I'll admit Trudy there. There really weren't those means for women. So you can say that lots of women, you can find out about women's history through journals. That was a typical way that a woman got her thinking out there. So Aunt Mary, Mary Moody Emerson, took a strong interest in the young people in her family. All of the brothers in Emerson's family put forth their best efforts for Aunt Mary. And she is a case study in the female intellectual from the 19th century, the spinster, looking for a way to make a living and to live her life. She had a diminutive stature. One book said she was 4'11", but I think that's a mythology. I don't think she was actually, but she was a very little woman. She had a formidable intellect, but she also could say things that were damagingly candid. And once I actually read this biography of her, it's like, oh God, I'm amazed that her family even put up with her anymore, because she was really had a acerbic character. Was hard to put up with. And eventually she started wearing, she wore what she wanted to be buried in, this like a black funeral gown. She wore that like around town. She just she was obsessed with death. So she wanted to be ready when that happened. But she herself was a very original religious thinker. She was a Platonist as well. And throughout his life, he wrote letters back and forth with Aunt Mary. And as a matter of fact, he depended on her for inspiration. When he was looking for something to think or something to write about or something to preach about when he became a preacher, he would say, Aunt Mary, send me your journals. And of course she did, but she called it Waldo's takings, that Waldo would take from her, her ideas. So, he kind of had a symbiotic relationship with her. Her own prose style influenced his prose style, kind of trenchant, ironic, very direct kind of prose style. And he eventually wanted to publish her work. He never was able to kind of bring it all together, these random journals that existed all over the place. But she was an important transcendentalist and a really important figure. So here's to being an aunt. Emerson's community, you really can't talk about Emerson without talking about community. And I think you can say that about all of us. We are who our friends are. Our friends make us who we are. So we'll throughout my talk, I'll talk more about Bronson Alcott, who was a very important friend for him, Margaret Fuller and Thoreau, what you might call the golden chain of influence. They were all working together in building intellectual friendships. He also was really close with Thomas Carlyle in Britain, a British essayist. They eventually kind of had a break. He knew Wordsworth, Coleridge, William Ellery Channing, who was the nephew of the Channing earlier, was kind of his favorite walking companion. So those are the people that were very important to him. So what was he like? And what do we hear from people say about what Emerson's personality was actually like? He always maintained a kind of a shy aloofness, a protective shell that harbored a sort of a poetic spirit. He was very retiring, very reserved, and at the same time, particularly if you read his poetry, he was very much a kind of a mystic and an ecstatic. His reticence was actually kind of unnerving at times. There was an emotional austerity to him. People said he could be kind of obtuse, socially very hesitant. His wife, his second wife, Lydian, and Margaret Fuller, they kind of complained about him at times, that he kind of, especially with women, maintained a very dignified reserve. He kind of had this inability to reciprocate to some extent. As far as his relationship with Margaret, she was a bit of a pill in her own right, but she often placed on him more demands than he could really accommodate in his emotionally austere personality. And he kind of complained about her at times. Maybe that was part of his relationship with women, that, you know, she would always obtrude her personal self into things. She would be emotionally volatile. She would gossip. She would be moody and overly vehement about things and sentimental. But, you know, despite that, they were really close intellectual partners and very, very good friends. He was described there, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was Supreme Court Justice, liberal Supreme Court Justice, called Emerson the Buddha of the West. He was known for having a kind of an enigmatic calm about him. That his modulated serenity made him seem like he was a visitant from a higher sphere. And people felt themselves in the presence of a rare and beautiful spirit when they were around him. They knew, they were warmed by his gentle smile, his kindliness, his optimism, despite many personal trials. And people described him as a kind of having a low-key lecture style, depersonalizing effect, as though a spirit were speaking through him. And it would be really cool if there was a video or a recording to hear exactly what he sounded like, because it sounds like it was pretty amazing, and you could understand why he was so popular. So Ralph started, Waldo, excuse me, nobody called him Ralph. He started Harvard in 1817 at the age of 14. That's kind of the way it was done back in those days. He was tall, he was thin, he was about 6 foot tall. He had light sandy hair, a large Roman nose, as you can see in the picture, and piercing blue eyes. Even at the age of 14, he did a lot of extracurricular reading, and he was reading in journals. He learned Greek. He wrote many compositions. He did a lot of Greek biblical scholarship, which, again, as I mentioned, there was people at the time that were questioning the absolute authority of the Bible. And even then, at the age of 14, he made time for daily walks in nature. He always had a really, really strong feeling for nature. Again, even while he was in school, he was interested in the imagination. He was interested in fairy tales, legends, folk tales, poetry. That was another thing, given that I'm also very interested in mythology, to know that the intellectuals at that time were actively engaging with mythology in very much the same way as sort of Jungians might engage with mythology. He had several professors that were really important to him throughout this period, who taught him about Greek literature and, again, about mythology. And he already had started reading Plato and Bacon. So when you're 14 or 15, that was what he was doing. And he was interested in oratory and rhetoric. And I mean, you might say that this time period was the classic age, of the golden age of oratory. So you would learn that in school. After he graduated from college, he got a job as a school teacher for young women. But he always dreamed of being a poet. He always dreamed of being an orator. He always dreamed of becoming a minister. He systematically kept many journals, many notebooks since he was 16 years old. And eventually he had 230 different notebooks. And when he would create an essay, he would go back through these notebooks trying to capture these thoughts and bring them together. I can share his frustration in that you take notes in so many different places and then you're trying to put it all together. Where did I put that? Where did I put that? He could really use a software writing organizing program, but eventually he had to keep an index of his notebooks. So that was an extra job in itself. In which notebook did I put my thoughts about this or that? And he was still a really energetic reader. Really, the story of his life is about, what was he reading and what was driving him. He really wanted to uncover the sources of power that exist in people. Where do people get their power from? And to be in touch with this kind of creative power. It was such a strong drive in him. Early on, I had never heard of a Scottish philosopher called Dugald Stewart, but Dugald Stewart was a compatriot in being kind of anti-Humean. This idea that you can only get knowledge through the senses. And that people that were in this school of thought were troubled about cause and effect, because if you can only get knowledge through your senses, you can never really know what causes something. And especially for people that are religious, they're concerned about that and they're looking for different philosophies. So Dugald Stewart influenced him a lot. He wrote about the history of idealism, and if I had all the time in the world, I'd love to read this. His take on how does this thread of idealism, whether the human mind possesses innate ideas, how does it find itself? How does it weave its way throughout history? And also about the morality. He was very much interested in the mind and moral perceptions. How should I live my life? So finally, around this time, he decided to go to divinity school, kind of in his family blood. It was just out there. His Aunt Mary was really pushing for it. She really wanted to see her nephews go to divinity school. And so in 1824, he gave up teaching, not so much for religious reasons as he wanted to succeed. He saw this as being a place where he could thrive, a way where he could be known for being eloquent. His aunt reminded him that he kind of owed it to the family. His ancestors had been clergymen for generations. His older brothers, William and Edward, they had both gone into law, and now the responsibility lay squarely on Waldo's shoulders. And so what Waldo said was, in divinity, I hope to thrive. I inherit from my sire a formality of manner and speech, but I derive from him a passionate love for the strains of eloquence. What we ardently love, we learn to imitate. My understanding venerates and my heart loves that cause which is dear to God and man. In my better hours, I am the believer of brilliant promises and can respect myself as the possessor of those powers which command the reasons and passions of the multitude. It's important to say that imagine a time when 50% of the people around you are suffering from a debilitating illness. Certainly we get closer to understanding what that might be like with the COVID pandemic, but tuberculosis was pandemic at that time. Half of all of the adults in Boston had it, and 1/3 of all deaths were from tuberculosis. And a lot of the physical problems that Waldo had probably were due to kind of some mild form of tuberculosis. He had something called uveitis, a rheumatic inflammation of the eye that produced headaches. He had to undergo 2 eye operations. Can't even imagine what that would be like in the early 19th century. He sometimes suffered from lameness, eye and hip problems relating to TB. And with all of his brothers, there was sort of a strain of physical weakness that they had. Their lungs and nervous systems were sort of bad. Around this time, he met Ellen Tucker, who he fell in love with. It was around 1828 they fell in love. She was only 16. She was a vivacious and pretty young woman whose father had died, left her a handsome legacy, and they fell deeply in love. When they fell in love, her brother had already died of tuberculosis, and he knew that she had tuberculosis. But they had a really close relationship. And you could actually say that I think that the consciousness of her illness brought them closer together. They were constantly communicating their feelings to each other. They were constantly in notes and in poetry and in person. They were a real stimulus for each other intellectually and emotionally. And because she had inherited quite a bit of money from her father, they had a pretty comfortable existence. And it was also his falling in love with her and wanting to marry her that made him join, become a minister. And he joined the Second Church in Boston as the preacher. And he actually wrote to his brother William that execution day approached. So in some ways he didn't want to be tied down to this church, but he kind of knew he had to, now he was married, he had to have a career. And but you found as a preacher that he really didn't refer to scripture all that often. He referred, and you won't be surprised to hear this, he was more interested in primary personal religious experience. He was not interested in mouthing words or conducting rituals that have been unchanged for 1,000 years. That he felt that it should be really a living faith, and that is what he preached, and that is what he lived. He's at this time, he has influences from a lot of different directions. He's reading theology, he's reading literature. He is actually a really rapid reader, and this is kind of consistent with his don't idolize people from the past. You don't only get from what you read what you need from it, what feeds your soul. So he was a really fast reader. He advocated skimming things for what you read. Don't idolize somebody or put them on a pedestal. It's for your own thought that you're reading this. He read Montaigne, he read Rousseau, Voltaire, Milton, Wordsworth. Montaigne was also an essayist. And I think he really admired his lively essay style. I tried to read a little bit about Montaigne because Waldo liked him so much. So he's just an active intellectual, avid reader. Emerson encountered Pythagoras. You might know I have my nom de plume, if you will, is Pythagorana. And Emerson was big on Pythagoras too, Pythagoras being thought of as the father of philosophy. And as one of Plato was one of his disciples. Pythagoras was, one of his teachings was in the fundamental principles of things are numbers, the importance of numbers, but also that things derive their beauty and order. Remember, we talked earlier about cosmos, beauty and order from participation in what we call the first intelligible essence, and that the first essence of things is number. That there are certain, and with numbers, there's proportions and that can be derived from numbers, the square root of 2, the square root of 3, the golden mean, that there's certain metaphysical principles that are embodied in matter. Pythagoras talked about symbols, that things must be learned by reading between the lines, or the use of symbols. Pythagoras used symbols in his teaching. The tetractys, this triangle, I should have a picture of that, with 1 dot, 2 dots, 3 dots, and 4 dots, 10 dots in total, was seen to embody like lots of symbolism in there, including the harmonic ratios and the principles of music are embodied in this tetractys. And so certainly Waldo as well used symbols, and you could say that a symbol or a metaphor, the derivation of the word metaphor is metaphorein, taking you beyond. So a metaphor is something that without talking or digging into the details, takes you to a higher thought. That's what a metaphor does. Boom, you're there. So that, that he admired that Pythagoras taught that. He also admired the work of Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic around the same time as Pythagoras. Heraclitus talked about the idea that the world is an emanation of the divine, what we call I don't know how to pronounce this, aporoia, and that the soul is an emanation. So there's a whole philosophy about emanation. What does that mean? And that true wisdom is in discovering the law which governs all things, how the physical world is connected to the world of eidos. Heraclitus talked about one of the key principles was logos, which is this underlying organizational principle in the world through which all things are one, and that the logos is hidden and perceptible only to the intelligence. That Heraclitus said, nature loves to hide. But again, there's something beyond the reach of sense perception. And, this word logos, you can see that the Greek influence on the New Testament and Christianity, the idea that Jesus was the word, Jesus was the logos, it has its roots way back, and it means more than Jesus is a word. It's a word that's really rich in meaning historically. A little bit more about I would love to read a lot more about Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is found in such thinkers as Plotinus, Iamblichus, Porphyry, Proclus, and you got to know that Waldo was definitely reading the Neoplatonists, and the Neoplatonists, they talked a lot about metamorphosis and a process where you start with purification, initiation, ascent, and noesis. And each one of these has different thoughts and maybe rituals associated with it. That finally, this wonderful word noesis, Noesis, did I write that there? No. Noesis, that where your consciousness is united with what they call the one. And it's kind of hard to understand exactly what would be meant by that. But there's the concept that that there's a ability in self-consciousness to ascend to the point where there's an absence of duality, that your mind, you're outside of physical experience, that the mind is one with these universal divine realities. He was also reading Zoroastrianism at that time. He starts to make a real intellectual breakaway around this time. He's not just reading theologians. He's not just reading philosophers. He made friends with a Cherokee chief. He's reading Swedenborg. His sermons become increasingly this world. He was focused with the God of the living. And one of his famous quotations, he says, "I will lift up my hands and say cosmos," meaning that the proper response to the world is absolute astonishment. And interestingly, at that time, one could read more about this. There's a woman named Maria Somerville who was a really big in the field of astronomy, and also Carolyn Herschel, who was the sister of an astronomer, and she worked with her brother. But so that's, you know, these wondrous things are being discovered about the universe also that kind of feeds into the thinking. He encounters two people. Again, I never heard of these people before, but it's important. He discovers a French thinker called Girondo. And Girondo, I never knew this when I was a religious studies major. Girondo basically was the founder, if you will, of comparative religious studies as a field of study. He wrote a book, a 3-volume book called the Histoire comparée des systèmes de philosophie, the comparative history of philosophical systems, and said there are enduring themes. This goes back to the idea of homo religiosus. There are enduring themes in all of philosophy, in all places and times, from the Greeks, the Chinese, Hindus, Persian, where this kind of religious sentiment is pan-human. You can see it, however disordered, he says, by the corruptions of cult and culture. And so this, you know, he was really discovering fresh sources of insight. Another person that he encountered who I hadn't heard about before was a man named Victor Cousin. And it's not really that important to understand about what his work was, but he focused on the many manifestations of the religious impulse in humankind and the development of idealist philosophy. And then he thought, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, that the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna was very sophisticated. So it was just that these pieces of work stand on an equal standing with the Bible. I'll probably get to a stopping point soon. I'm going to whip through this part here. Around 1837, his wife, his dearly beloved wife, Ellen, died of tuberculosis. He was only 27 when she died, and he took it really hard. He actually never really outlived the sense of loss. Since he knew she was going to die, in some senses, you can say she was his conduit to the eternal. And he really felt that Christianity wasn't much help to him in that he decided to reach out for his own resources and go it alone. Again, you see that theme recurring throughout his life. He viscerally believed, because he loved her so much, in the reality and the primacy of spirit. And her death actually brought out in him a more of a capacity for sympathy. He became a deeper, warmer person, and to some extent, it actually freed him. It freed him from prevailing thought in Boston, his responsibilities on the school board, his career things that he was doing. In early 1832, he visited her tomb, and he couldn't help himself. He opened up the coffin, and some people say, well, up until that point, he didn't really believe she was dead. He believed she was dead, but he just couldn't help his kind of curiosity, wanting to see her. And it was that moment, seeing her corpse, where he understood. He had a moment that he understood that he could no longer stay in his job. he abandoned all notions of conventional happiness. And at that time, he then, in September of 1832, he resigned from the church. So he gave up a guaranteed social position. He gave up institutional support, a generous and assured salary. But what he gained was the ability to live life on his own terms. And you can really say that his break with the church wasn't because what didn't mark a loss of faith, it marked that he had too much faith. And the issue that bothered him was that he felt that the communion ceremony, as prescribed in the church, reduced communion to eating and drinking. And he thought that communion with the divine was much more than eating bread and drinking wine, and whatever you think about that sacrament. And it can be very, very beautiful, but he refused to administer the Lord's Supper at his church. And of course, his church said, well, you that's part of your job, you got to do it. So he really didn't, he thought that the church relied too much on inherited forms. He believed in a deep inner life. He believed that freedom should be the essence of Christianity, and all of its institutions should be just as flexible. And shortly after that, he left for Europe. So I will stop there for today. I think I have now talked for 1 hour and 52 minutes. So I'm going to stop my screen share for a minute.